The first time I noticed the tape, I was standing under one of those humming fluorescent fixtures that makes everybody look a little dead. I had a box cutter in one hand, gloves tucked in my back pocket because the latex ones made my fingers sweat, and an evidence carton in front of me that was supposed to have been sealed since the late 90s. You get used to old boxes in a place like that. Old tape dries out, labels curl, marker fades. None of that means anything by itself. What got me was how the seal looked layered. There was the original evidence tape underneath, yellowed and brittle, then a newer strip over the exact same line, cleaner, tighter, the adhesive still glossy in spots. It was like somebody had closed the thing again and wanted it to look like nobody ever had. I remember running my thumb over it and thinking, all right, some clerk reopened it, fixed whatever needed fixing, then forgot to log it. That was the easy answer. That place ran on easy answers. The annex under the Jefferson Parish Courthouse complex was basically a long, wet concrete throat full of paper. Low ceilings, rows and rows of shelving. Dehumidifiers droning so constantly that after an hour your brain sort of filed the noise away and let it become part of your blood. The air smelled like damp paper and bleach. Even with the machines running, your skin always felt a little sticky down there, like the room had breathed on you. And that box, with the new tape laid right over the old seal, had a case number I already knew because I had scanned a related file the day before, one with the same last name I'd started seeing everywhere. That was the part I didn't have a good explanation for. I took that contract because I needed the money. There's no noble version of it. I had spent years doing insurance and fraud investigations, the kind of work that teaches you people hide things for boring reasons way more often than dramatic ones. And then I burned out on it hard. A temporary digitization contract sounded quiet. Scan old court records, log metadata, move on. No claimants crying in parking lots. No private calls with adjusters trying to get you to phrase something just a little differently. Just boxes, paper, and a paycheck that was better than anything I'd seen in a while. Professionally, I was alone most of the time. There were other people in the building, sure, but the annex had this way of making everybody feel far away from each other. You'd hear a cart rattle somewhere down another aisle, or a cough or a radio go off muffled through concrete, but mostly it was just you and the paperwork, which suited me fine. I like systems. I like labels. I still keep old burner phones in labeled freezer bags under my garage workbench because back when I did fraud work, you learned not to trust dead devices to stay dead, and apparently I never fully got over that. My kitchen junk drawer has batteries sorted by type. That's who I am. So a basement full of boxed records should have been my thing. Most of what I scanned was ordinary. Property disputes, closed criminal cases, depositions from fights between business partners who hated each other with the kind of energy only money can generate. Every now and then something ugly floated past, but even ugly gets dull when it's all formatted the same. Brown folders, county stamps, staple marks, coffee rings. Somebody's rushed initials in blue ink. Then that surname kept showing up. Not constantly, not enough that you'd notice in a day or two, but enough that after maybe the first week I started having that itch in the back of my head. Same name tied to unrelated investigations over a stretch of about 20 years. Different plaintiffs, different charges, different neighborhoods. Sometimes it was a witness, sometimes an investigator, sometimes a subcontractor listed in an exhibit. Once it was just buried in an invoice attachment. Same construction company orbiting around multiple corruption cases too. Always off to one side, never centered enough to jump off the page unless you were already looking. And I probably was looking more than I should have been. The setup of the job was simple. I came in around mid-morning most days with one of those awful store-brand cold brews in a can because the courthouse coffee tasted like hot coins. I signed in, got my cart assignments, rolled boxes to the scanning station, and worked through them in order. I wore the same 2 button-downs all week because the annex made everything smell faintly like mildew anyway, so why waste your nicer clothes? I kept a little hand lotion in my bag because the bleach in the air dried out my knuckles. Mundane stuff. That's what the job was supposed to be. The first couple times I found boxes with newer tape over older seals, I wrote it off. Overworked clerks. Sloppy chain of custody after the fact. Maybe something got misfiled and they patched it quietly. Government offices are full of quiet patch jobs. Anyone who's ever had to request a copy of anything from a courthouse knows that. I told myself that more than once. Then I started seeing gaps on the shelves, whole sections where boxes had been removed without any checkout logs clipped to the aisle markers. Just empty spaces with dust outlines where cartons used to sit. The annex had a sign-out system. It wasn't fancy, but it existed, and when records went out, somebody noted it. These gaps looked like teeth missing from the same side of a jaw. Still, I kept going. That's the part I don't really get to make myself look good in. I knew something was off early. Not enough to know what, but enough to know it wasn't just ordinary clutter. And I kept scanning because the contract paid more than I had earned in years. Because my truck needed work. Because I was tired of being behind on everything. Because once you are financially cornered, you start grading wrongness on a curve. At first, the issue was attachments, witness statements missing from corruption cases tied to that same construction company. A deposition transcript with exhibit tabs, but no exhibits. A file index that listed 3 supplemental statements, and the folder only held 1. I would flag the file, send the note up, and by the next morning that entire case would be gone from my assignment cart. Not fixed, not returned with a correction, just removed. The first time I mentioned it to a supervisor, he barely looked at me. He had one of those courthouse polos with the parish logo on it, and he always smelled like hand sanitizer over sweat. He said, "Don't confuse clerical mistakes with patterns." That was exactly the kind of sentence that should make me stop. Instead, I nodded like an idiot and said something about just wanting the metadata clean. He gave me this flat little smile and moved on. After that, whenever I found an incomplete file, I started checking it more carefully before flagging it. Not because I was trying to blow anything open, but because I wanted to know if I was imagining the pattern. That was my official excuse to myself. Just verify it. Make sure you're not turning coincidence into a hobby. That's when I noticed the smell. Every incomplete file, or at least everyone tied to that cluster of cases, had the faintest cigarette smell in it. Not strong. Just enough that when you opened the folder, there was this stale tobacco note under the paper rot and bleach. The annex was strictly smoke-free, had been for years. Nobody should have been smoking anywhere near those records. A single folder, fine, maybe transferred from some old office, but over and over on the same kind of cases. I remember sitting there with one open in front of me, looking at a missing witness statement notation, and just holding still with that smell in my nose while the dehumidifier droned behind me. That was when the pattern stopped feeling like maybe. Then I'd talk myself back down again. Maybe the files all came from some old records room where people used to smoke. Maybe somebody in intake handled them who smoked in their car. Maybe the reason cases kept disappearing from my assignments was because I was annoying, and they didn't want contract workers poking around in sensitive material. All of those are normal explanations, more normal than the truth turned out to be. A couple weeks into it, I stayed late because I was trying to finish a batch before a storm rolled in. Down there, you could tell weather was getting bad, only because the walls started feeling colder and the pipes ticked more. I had gone to return a cart when I heard voices from around the cinder block corner near one of the secured storage rooms. 2 parish employees, not supervisors I dealt with directly, but people I'd seen enough to recognize by posture and voice. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. They just didn't know anybody else was down there. One of them said something about getting boxes marked for destruction moved before appeal deadlines expired, not after, before. The other one said, "Then it needs to be tonight." I stood there with my hand on the cart handle and did absolutely nothing. I could tell you I froze because I was shocked. Maybe some of that is true. Mostly I said nothing because my next direct deposit had not hit yet. That's the cleanest way I know to say it. I walked back to my station. I finished the last 2 files on the cart. I signed out. I drove to the employee lot in the rain, and there was a strip of shredded paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Just one strip. It had part of a case number on it, enough that I recognized it from a file I'd scanned earlier that day. That should have been it for me. That should have been the point where I took it upstairs, found literally anybody with authority, and made a scene. Instead, I sat in my truck with the rain ticking on the windshield and thought maybe somebody is messing with me because they know I've been asking questions. Maybe it's a warning to mind my business. Maybe it's a prank, maybe it's not even related. I went back the next morning. If you want to judge me for that, I won't argue. I still judge me for that. The next few days had that awful stop-start quality where every hour you think maybe things are settling down. Then something small knocks the air out of that thought. A file I'd flagged would vanish. Then an ordinary stack would come through, and nothing in it would be strange. A supervisor would be almost friendly. Then I'd see another seal layered over an old seal. I told myself if it got any clearer, I'd act, which is a nice fake line people feed themselves when they already know they're past it. The storm that broke it open hit hard enough to flood part of the basement. South Louisiana, heavy rain, bad drainage, none of that is exotic. Water finds every weakness in a building and tells on it. We got pulled off scanning to help move boxes off the lowest shelves before they soaked through. Everybody was suddenly in motion. Carts squealing wet shoes on concrete. People shouting aisle numbers over the hum of the machines. That chaos almost felt like relief. Weirdly enough, disaster has rules. Floodwater is simple. You move the boxes. You save what you can. Nobody is talking about missing statements or case patterns when the floor has an inch of dirty water on it. I was shifting records from one wall section when I noticed the shelving didn't sit flush just on one segment in the back. The anchor bolts were there, but the frame had a little give to it, like it had been mounted over something and adjusted. One side dragged when we pulled from the lower shelf. I leaned in, put my shoulder against the unit, and it moved enough for me to see there was a recessed space behind it. False panel, not fancy, just practical. Inside were boxed files wrapped in plastic, marked with destruction dates from years earlier. There are moments where your mind stays polite long after it shouldn't. I actually remember thinking, well, that's an administrative nightmare, like I had just found somebody's terrible filing workaround. Then I opened one, witness material, supplemental statements, internal memos, cases flagged as destroyed, yet sitting right there dry behind the wall. Multiple files involving witnesses who later disappeared, recanted, or died in ways the paperwork described so blandly it made me feel sick. Died unexpectedly, unavailable for further testimony. Declined to cooperate after prior willingness. You start reading enough of that, and the language itself begins to sound guilty. I should have backed out then. Taken one box, gone upstairs, put it on a desk in public view. But once you are in it, really in it, there's this rotten instinct to know the next thing. Just one more folder. Just enough context to make sense of what you've already seen. So I kept going. And that's how I found the photographs. The folder was sealed, newer tape again, and inside were surveillance stills from the annex parking garage after hours. Grainy black and white shots from different dates. Courthouse employees moving evidence boxes from one vehicle to another. Not criminals in ski masks, not some cinematic nonsense. People with badges, work shoes, one man in a Parrish polo shirt. My supervisor, there he was, clear enough that I didn't need to lean in, or squint, or tell myself maybe it was someone shaped like him. Same supervisor who had warned me not to confuse clerical mistakes with patterns. In one photo, he had a box balanced against his hip like it weighed nothing. In another, he was looking over his shoulder toward the camera, not at it exactly, but close enough that for a second it felt like he'd caught me seeing him. I sat down on the concrete floor, not gracefully. My legs just stopped doing their part. My mouth had gone dry enough that I could taste dust. The wet air down there suddenly felt used, like too many people had already breathed it. I kept hearing water hit the far drain, and the dehumidifiers grinding, and somebody shouting, for more pallets 3 aisles over, all this normal emergency noise. And right in the middle of it, I was holding proof that the people managing that place were moving evidence around themselves. That was the moment it tipped from suspicion into context. Too much context. Enough that I understood in a very ugly and immediate way. That if I knew this much by accident, then other people had known a whole lot more on purpose. I put the photos back. I took out my phone, then put it away, then took it out again. My hands were slick and stupid. I ended up using the old copy machine in the side office later because it felt less traceable than photographing everything on my personal phone. which maybe tells you where my brain was. Still thinking in terms of process. Still thinking there was a clean way to handle dirty things. Copied portions. Not everything. Enough. Case numbers, destruction sheets, a few witness notations, 2 of the surveillance images. I sealed the copies in a freezer bag that night in my motel room, because I had one in my truck door from years of old habits, and because apparently when I'm scared I organize. Then I kept working just long enough to not make my exit look like an exit. That part is hard to admit too. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't march into an office. I scanned a few more days of ordinary files, made normal conversation, laughed once at a guy complaining about the air conditioning upstairs being too cold, which felt deranged considering what I knew. I was buying time. For what? I don't know. Courage, maybe. Distance. I sent the copies anonymously to a journalist out of New Orleans who had done work on local corruption. No return address, no name. Just the packet and a short note that said he should compare destroyed records against surviving annex inventory and look at appeal windows on certain cases. Then I resigned without notice. I told them there was a family issue back home, packed my truck, crossed state lines before the journalist ever published anything. Incomplete exit, if you want the neat phrase. I left, but none of it felt left. Months later, the annex had an electrical fire. That was the official story, electrical fire. Archived sections destroyed. Unfortunate loss of old material. Maybe that's exactly what it was. Buildings burn, wiring fails, paper goes up fast, all true still. The journalist's story did come out, smaller than I hoped, bigger than I feared. It caused noise for a while. Questions, internal reviews, defensive statements. I don't know how much landed and how much got buried again. Once I was out, I stayed out. I had already learned what institutions sound like when they're protecting themselves, and I couldn't take hearing it dressed up as procedure one more time. What stayed with me wasn't one single file. It was the scale you can feel without being able to measure. The shelves with gaps, the newer tape over older seals, the cigarette smell in smoke-free folders, the boxes marked destroyed that were only hidden, the photographs of employees moving evidence like groceries after hours. I still have photocopies sealed inside freezer bags under my garage workbench. Destroying them feels dangerous, and keeping them feels worse. Every now and then I'll be looking for a screwdriver or a socket wrench and see those bags pushed behind a paint can, labeled in my own handwriting, and it makes my stomach go hard for a second. I don't trust institutional record keeping at all anymore. Not court files, not insurance records, not anything that asks you to believe a chain stayed intact because the form says it did. And what I never learned, what I don't think I can stop turning over, is how many convictions, how many disappearances, how many neat little closed investigations depended on what got quietly changed in that annex long before I ever walked in there. Story break. The next one is quieter, and in a way that made it harder to shake. I found the receipt while I was standing at my brother's kitchen counter in my socks, because the floors in that house stayed cold no matter what the thermostat said. It had slid behind one of those ceramic canisters people keep flour in and never really use, and it was folded in half like somebody had tucked it away quickly and forgotten it. Bread, coffee, canned soup, pipe tobacco, batteries, ordinary things. The date on it was what made me stop. It was from years after everyone said Lucien had basically stopped living there. The heating vent under the window clicked once, then again, then settled. The house smelled like dust and old pipe tobacco, even though he had been gone for months by then. And the morning light coming through that kitchen always seemed too thin to warm anything up. I remember standing there with that little strip of paper between my fingers and thinking, all right, so he came back more often than he told people. That was not, by itself, a sinister discovery. Families only know each other in patches once everyone gets older. My brother and I were close in the way adult siblings often are, which is to say lovingly, inconsistently, and with years of missing middle stitched between holidays. Still, there was an upstairs bedroom in that farmhouse that stayed cleaner than the rest of the house, and one of the interior doors had a lock set the wrong way around. That was the first thing I couldn't fold neatly into the story I already had about him. Lucien died after a stroke, quick, from what I was told, as merciful as those things ever are. He had lived alone for years outside Windham County, or mostly alone, depending on which neighbor you asked and how much patience they had for the subject. I am older than most people probably picture for these stories. I say that only because by the time I was clearing his house, I had reached that age where practical tasks arrive before grief has properly found a chair. There was an estate to settle, a property to assess, accounts to close. Nobody else was going to do it. I am comfortable alone. Always have been. My own home is quiet. I keep handwritten birthday cards from every family member in separate kitchen drawers organized by year, which sounds either sentimental or deranged depending on your personality. Lucien used to tease me about it. He said if civilization collapsed, I'd still have an index system. So being in that farmhouse by myself did not bother me at first. In some ways, it was easier. I could sort, box, decide, throw out. No committee. The house itself looked untouched in a very particular way, not abandoned, maintained just enough that it had dignity. The clapboard exterior needed paint. The porch leaned a little. The mudroom had 3 pairs of boots by the wall, all with dry dirt still in the treads. The refrigerator contained exactly what you'd expect from a man who lived mostly on his own. Mustard, butter, pickles, half a jar of olives, and a jar of something unidentifiable that I did not investigate further because some mysteries earned their privacy. His pipe rack was still on the side table. One of his reading glasses' arms was taped where it had snapped. The dish towel in the kitchen had a stitched rooster on it that I remembered from our mother's house. Neighbors told me he barely visited the property during the last decade. They said he spent more time elsewhere, or traveling, or staying with friends, though nobody was especially precise. Yet the farmhouse felt used, not heavily, but recently. Sheets changed on one upstairs bed, a clean glass on the bathroom sink, grocery receipts from dates that did not fit the version of his life I'd been given. And then there were the locks. If you've ever replaced a bedroom doorknob, you know how obvious it is when the lock faces the wrong direction. 2 upstairs rooms had interior locks reversed so they could be secured from the hallway side. That is not the kind of thing that happens by accident. I stood there with one hand on the knob, my thumb over the small turn latch, and tried to imagine a normal explanation. Maybe Lucien had guests who wanted privacy. Maybe the hardware had been installed wrong years earlier and never fixed. Maybe. House clearing becomes a game of maybes if you let it. One bedroom in particular was almost unnervingly clean compared to the rest of the place. Fresh sheets, window washed, no personal clutter. Just a narrow bed, a chair, a pitcher on the dresser, and a rug that looked newer than anything else in the house. The room felt prepared, not lived in. It also had one of the reversed locks. I didn't like that, but not enough yet to name why. The first few days were mostly ordinary work. I wore my old green cardigan over 2 sweaters because the cold came up through the floorboards. I sorted legal documents at the dining room table and ate canned soup in the evenings from one of Lucien's heavy stoneware bowls. At night, the heating vents clicked and banged through the walls with such confidence that the house sounded occupied even when it wasn't. The smell of dust would lift when the heat first came on, then settle back into pipe tobacco and old wood. I found the cassette tapes on the 3rd day. There was loose board under the bed in the cleaned upstairs room. Not dramatically loose, just enough that when I moved the frame to vacuum underneath, it shifted. Beneath it was a shallow space and a small stack of tapes wrapped in a dish towel. No labels except dates on 2 of them. I had to dig around in a hall closet for an old player because Lucien never threw electronics away. And of course it still worked after I smacked it once. On the first tape, I heard his voice almost immediately, not dictating notes, arguing, not yelling exactly. That was what unsettled me. Lucien sounded controlled in a way that meant he had already been angry for a while. He kept talking to someone he never named. On one tape he said, "They cannot know she stayed here." On another he said, "You said it was temporary." There was usually another voice too quiet to make out, or a rustle, or footsteps, or a door closing somewhere in the background. I listened to those at the dining room table, with one of his old lamps on and my reading glasses sliding down my nose, pausing every few minutes to scribble notes on the back of an envelope because I suddenly felt foolishly certain details would matter later. I don't know why I thought that. Instinct, maybe. Or the way grief turns a person into an archivist against their will. Around the same time, I started noticing gaps in the photo albums. Not all over. In clusters, a few years missing here and there. Places where family photographs had clearly been removed from adhesive pages, leaving those dark little corner marks and cleaner rectangles where the paper beneath had not faded. Specific periods, not random damage. When I first realized it, I sat there with the album open on my lap and said out loud to an empty room, "What were you doing?" Which is not useful, but it is honest. I told myself there might still be a simple explanation. Lucien had always taken in strays of one kind or another. Dogs mostly, but people too, in the casual rural way where someone knows someone who needs a couch for a week, and somehow that becomes a season. He had a generous streak that made him difficult and kind in equal measure. If those tapes were about some woman he was helping, perhaps the secrecy was only secrecy because gossip travels faster than mercy in small places. Then I went next door and spoke to one of the neighbors. She was elderly, sharp as a tack, and visibly unhappy that I had asked a question she had apparently spent years not answering. We stood in her kitchen while she made tea she did not offer me, which I respected. After a long pause, she told me Lucien sometimes housed vulnerable travelers, mostly women leaving bad situations, people trying to get somewhere or disappear long enough to breathe. She said he believed local authorities couldn't always be trusted to help, that sometimes the people doing the asking were connected to the people being fled. You can imagine how that landed. Part of me thought, yes, of course, that sounds like my brother. Another part thought, or this is what isolation sounded like after it fermented a while. Rural suspicion can wear the same coat as wisdom. She wouldn't give me names, wouldn't say how many, wouldn't say whether she'd ever actually seen anyone staying there. When I got back to the farmhouse that evening, I played another tape. Lucien said, "The upstairs room is not for discussion," and the heating vent by the table clicked exactly 3 times. I looked up like the fool had addressed me. That happened again later. Same phrase on a different tape. 3 clicks. Not supernatural. I don't mean it that way. Old heating systems make noise. Anybody who knows old houses is probably rolling their eyes right now. I get it. But when you're alone in a dead sibling's home, hearing him mention a room you are sitting under, and the vent answers in the exact same rhythm twice, your body notices before your mind starts being sensible again. The deeper I got into the documents, the less settled the official version of Lucien's life became. He had legal files tucked into recipe books, insurance papers in a toolbox drawer, a post office box key taped beneath the underside of his desk. The man had hidden things in plain sight with the confidence of somebody who assumes only he will ever be looking. The false death paperwork turned up in a folder of land tax documents of all places. I almost missed it because it was tucked between survey maps. It concerned a woman whose name I had seen once in a margin note and once on an envelope with no return address. According to the documents, she had officially died decades earlier under another identity. There were certified copies, state forms, enough paperwork to make the death feel real on paper, which I suppose was the point. Except there was also recent mail. Very recent, still arriving monthly to that same name at a nearby post office box. I sat on the floor in Lucien's study with those papers around me and felt this terrible splitting inside my understanding of him. Either he had spent years helping vulnerable people hide from something real, or he had spent years helping someone remain legally dead while physically alive. Maybe those are not as separate as I want them to be. That is part of what still bothers me. The moral line got blurry there, and I knew it. I could have brought everything to the estate attorney then, or the sheriff, or at least some official person whose desk was less covered in dust than mine. I did not. I told myself I needed to know what I was turning over before I turned it over. I told myself exposing the wrong thing the wrong way might place somebody in danger if Lucien had in fact been protecting them from a real threat. That may even be true. It was also a convenient reason not to set off something I didn't understand, so I kept going. I checked the post office box using the key I found. There was nothing inside that day except a flyer and one water bill addressed to a name that, according to state records, belonged to a dead woman. I did not wait around to see who might collect it. I did not feel brave enough for that, and if I'm honest, I had already started wanting this to remain partly unsolved. because full answers were beginning to look worse than uncertainty. The recent photograph came last. Lucien had an old dresser with a mirror spotted around the edges. I was clearing the last drawer when I noticed the mirror backing had been loosened and retacked. Behind it was a photograph, not even hidden very well once you knew to look. In it, my brother stood outside the farmhouse in his winter coat, thinner than I remembered. One hand in his pocket, the other resting on the shoulder of a woman I did not know, except I did, because her face matched the dead name in the paperwork. The date on the processing sleeve was from 2 years before he died. I stared at that picture for so long my arms started aching from holding it up. They weren't posing like lovers, not quite like family either. Just standing close with the kind of stillness people have when being photographed matters more than the photo itself. That night I played the last cassette tape. I waited until dark for reasons I cannot defend. Maybe because grief makes rituals where none are needed. Maybe because I didn't want daylight around whatever final explanation there might be. I sat in the cleaned upstairs room, the one with the reversed lock, with the cassette player on the bedspread and the door open behind me. The vent in the hall clicked softly through the house. My hands were cold even inside my sleeves. Lucien sounded tired on the tape, not frightened, not rushed, just finished. He said very calmly, "If anyone comes asking after her, tell them you buried me alone." Then there was a pause, and a second voice close by this time, a woman's voice I think, quietly laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a happy one either. More like somebody hearing a line they have heard before and knowing it is both serious and impossible. Then the tape ended. I did not replay it. I did not sit there piecing it apart like a detective. I shut the machine off, put the tape back in its case, and for a minute or two I just listened to the house making its ordinary sounds, the heat, the old wood, something tapping lightly against the siding outside. I knew then I was done investigating. Not because I had answers, because I had enough to do harm with them. The next morning I packed several boxes of documents, the tapes, the photograph, and the death paperwork. I sealed them. I did not report them. I did not hand them to the attorney. I did not mention the post office box. I closed the upstairs room and left the key where I found it. I locked the farmhouse, drove away, and never went back. That was my exit. Preemptive, if you want the official term. I left before the truth had to choose a shape. Settling the estate after that became a performance of normal tasks. Sign here. Transfer that. Sell this. Keep that. I answered questions with smaller truths that did not force bigger ones into the room. I told people Lucien had become private. That much was easy. Nobody pressed. Families are full of places where curiosity learns manners. What changed in me was stranger than grief alone. I stopped displaying family photographs in my home because every memory of my brother now feels partially fabricated. Or maybe edited is the better word. Not false exactly. Just incomplete in a way that makes the true parts wobble. I still have those birthday cards sorted in drawers by year, but now every November I get an unsigned one postmarked from Vermont. No note beyond happy birthday, no signature. The handwriting changes slightly, or seems to. Some years I think it's Lucien's old habit of printing too carefully, and then I feel ridiculous for even thinking that. I have never answered one. I wouldn't know where to send it. And what I still don't know, the part that stays unsettled no matter how old I get, is whether my brother spent those years protecting vulnerable people from something real, or helping one woman stay dead on paper for far too long. Story break. The last one is the one I go back to when I'm driving at night and trying not to. By the time I got the driver's door open on the rolled sedan, my radio had already slipped sideways on my jacket, and I was on my knees in gravel trying not to cut my hand on the window glass. The car was on its passenger side down a shallow embankment, one rear wheel still turning a little, ticking as it slowed. I could smell coolant, wet dirt, and diesel from the interstate above us. That sharp truck stop smell that carries farther in the cold. The woman inside was conscious, barely, and kept saying she couldn't find her phone, even though it was wedged against the roofliner right next to her face. I remember saying, "Don't worry about the phone," like that was useful. Then I looked across the median and saw a dark blue SUV sitting on the opposite shoulder with its headlights off. just idling there, no flashers, no spotlight, no road service bar on top, just shape and engine noise. I knew that plate before I let myself admit I knew it. If you've never worked overnight roadside along that stretch of Interstate 84 between Morrow County and Umatilla County, it is a weird kind of lonely. Not empty exactly. Trucks are always out there somewhere. You catch their lights in the distance. Tire noise bounces strangely off empty overpasses after midnight, and the wind off the sagebrush carries dust and cold in turns, like the air can't decide what season it's in. But when you're on the shoulder with one stranded driver and dispatch crackling in your ear, it can feel like the rest of the world has gone very far away. I worked roadside assistance. Overnight shift, mostly. Lockouts, dead batteries, blowouts, the occasional bad crash scene if I happened to be closest, and emergency services were still en route. Professionally alone is the clean way to say it. I had a company truck, a laptop mount, 3 high-vis jackets because they disappear somehow, and a habit of memorizing license plates automatically. I repeat them silently during long drives to stay alert. Been doing it for years. It keeps my brain occupied when the highway starts turning into white noise. That night with the rolled sedan, the plate on the blue SUV hit me like a word I had already said 3 times that week. Not that week, actually. Over 2 weeks, 3 separate scenes. 3 different locations and times. Same dark blue SUV. Once at a fender bender near a cattle fence. Once parked too far off the shoulder at a dead battery call, where the driver swore no one else had been there when she first pulled over. And now across the median from me while a woman bled lightly from a cut on her forehead and asked for a phone that was 6 inches from her hand. I told myself it was confirmation bias. That's a real thing, and professionals talk themselves down with real things. Exhaustion makes patterns. Night shifts make them faster. The Oregon stretch I covered had lots of similar vehicles, lots of dark paint, lots of owners who put on aftermarket wheels and liked to creep around at odd hours. It was freezing. My adrenaline was up. The overpass noise was echoing. I said the plate in my head again anyway, just to be sure. Same one. Before state police got there, the SUV rolled away into the dark like it had gotten what it came for. That was the opening scene for me, even if I didn't know it then. The mid-crisis part. The moment later events kept snapping back to. When people picture roadside work, they think flat tires and grateful families, and sure, some of it is that. A lot of it is paperwork, bad coffee from mini-marts, and standing in freezing wind trying to make your hands function, while somebody apologizes for not knowing where their wheel lock key is. I had fingerless glove liners under my work gloves because I needed dexterity for battery clamps. I kept jerky in the center console and forgot about it until it turned into a salt brick. I knew which truck stop bathrooms were cleanest between Boardman and Pendleton. That was the texture of my life. What started bothering me wasn't any one call. It was how often certain vehicles seemed to arrive before they should have known where to go. A stranded motorist calls us, or uses an app, or gets patched through by insurance. Dispatch pings the nearest truck, clean enough system. But I kept showing up to scenes where someone else had already made contact, usually gone by the time I arrived, or lingering just long enough to say they were just checking on things. Drivers would mention it casually at first. Nice guy in an SUV stopped. Woman in a pickup knew my first name somehow. Somebody offered to jump before your company got here. No big deal, except dispatch records never mentioned those callers. And the language repeated. Every time an unofficial assist got described, somewhere in the chain there was that same phrase, spoken in the same calm tone. We already have someone nearby. I heard it live on a few calls too. A dispatcher, not my regular one always, but someone in overflow routing, saying it so evenly it sounded pre-recorded. We already have someone nearby. Nearby who? That question stayed in my throat for days before I said it out loud to anybody. Again, because if you raise the wrong alarm in operations, you can hurt people's jobs fast. Dispatch centers run on goodwill and duct tape half the time. Systems overlap. Vendors subcontract. Records lag. If I marched in there accusing people of leaking customer locations because I was tired and suspicious, that wouldn't just bounce back on me. It would hit coworkers who were doing their best in a bad industry. So I kept my mouth shut longer than I should have. That is my moral failure in this one. Not flashy, just delay. One night outside Hermiston, I was helping a man with a shredded tire. Normal job. He was wearing house slippers in the freezing air because he hadn't expected to get out of the car, which for some reason always makes me feel sadder than real tragedy, the small indignities. While I was lowering the spare, he asked me if roadside companies ever sold customer locations. I looked up and said, "Not that I know of," he said, "because the guy who stopped before you got here knew my name before I told him." Then he laughed a little, like he was embarrassed to have said it. I asked what the vehicle was. "Dark SUV, maybe blue or black," he said. The guy was polite. Too polite was how he put it. Asked if he was alone. Asked where he was headed after this. Then when the driver said company roadside was on the way, the guy smiled and said, "We already have someone nearby." Same tone. I didn't sleep after that shift. Not that I was sleeping well anyway. Night work rewires you. I lay in my apartment with the blinds cracked, listening to daylight traffic and kept replaying the little details. Same vehicle maybe. Same phrase definitely. Unofficial help arriving before official help. Drivers being addressed by name. My brain kept bouncing between two conclusions, both ugly. Either I was stitching random events together into a paranoia blanket because I worked too many overnights, or something in the dispatch chain was feeding location data to people who should not have had it. Once that second possibility gets in, everything starts looking double. I began noticing abandoned vehicles differently too. Along that stretch there are always some, but these bothered me because they sat too long. Multiple cars left untouched for days without police tags or towing notices, as if the normal administrative trail had missed them or avoided them. A white pickup near a frontage road. A sedan with one window down 3 nights in a row. A hatchback half sunk in gravel past a closed waste station. Maybe each had a perfectly normal explanation. Together they started looking like punctuation. I asked dispatch for archived call access under the excuse of auditing response times. That part I could justify professionally. I was good at the system side. Competence will buy you room if you've earned it. So I pulled logs, not all at once, just a little at a time so I wouldn't flag somebody's curiosity alert, if there even was such a thing. There it was. Dozens of calls routed through a secondary number that was not tied to our official roadside system. Not a vendor line I recognized, not a county emergency transfer, just a side channel. Calls came in, got mirrored or rerouted, then units were assigned or supposedly assigned. In several cases, our trucks arrived late to find the motorist already gone, vehicle abandoned, no formal cancellation. A few incident reports downstream involved robberies. A couple involved missing persons that I only found because I cross-checked public records on my own time, which you are absolutely not supposed to do. But once your trust in the system starts thinning, policy stops sounding holy. And yes, before anyone says it, I know how that sounds. I know what a person can do to their own sanity by living in logs and late-night records. I really do. I kept trying to prove myself wrong. That was half the point. Then I ran the blue SUV plate. The timing on that was almost stupid. I had held off doing it, because once I did, I would either feel relieved and embarrassed, or I would have one more solid piece and no excuse left. It came back to a vehicle officially scrapped 3 years earlier after a flood claim. Registered owner deceased in that same flood according to state records. I checked twice, same result. That should not happen cleanly. Plates get reassigned, records get updated. A dead owner's scrapped vehicle should not be calmly driving around 3 counties later and showing up at crash scenes before responders. After that, every shift felt tilted. I started watching my mirrors more than the road ahead. I kept my personal phone off the dash. I took different fuel stops. I told myself these were temporary precautions until I reported what I had. Then I didn't report it right away, because reporting it meant deciding whether I believed my own evidence enough to drag real people into it. There is a point where caution and cowardice look the same from inside your own head. I was standing right on it. The peak came near Boardman on a stretch of frontage road that runs darker than it should. Female caller, mid-30s maybe, flat tire, nervous voice on dispatch. I was the closest truck. She gave a mile marker that was technically a little off, which happens all the time because nobody is calm when they're stranded at night. I found her parked just off the access road with one hazard light blinking faster than the other. Sagebrush wind, freezing air, diesel hanging faint from the interstate. The kind of cold that makes the metal tools sting your palm through gloves. She was standing outside the car when I got there, hugging her coat shut. I remember noticing her rear plate automatically, then the mud on the wheel well, then the fact that she kept looking behind me while I was setting the jack. Professional habit. Scene, person, vehicle, exits. You learn your own order. I asked if anyone else had stopped. She said. A man called me by my first name and said help was nearby. My stomach tightened so fast I fumbled the lug wrench. I tried to keep my voice level and ask what he was driving. She didn't answer right away. She was looking at my truck radio. Then my secondary handset, the one we almost never used unless primary dispatch got messy, crackled with an open carrier, and I heard a voice, quiet, calm. One of our dispatchers, or sounding exactly like one. He gave my exact location, then my vehicle description, then said female customer still on scene, not to me, to whoever was listening on that frequency. For a second I honestly could not move. My hands just stopped where they were on the wrench. It felt like all the air I had was suddenly behind my ribs instead of in front of them. The woman looked at me and must have seen my face change because she took one step backward. Headlights came up from a dark frontage road to our left. Dark blue SUV, no hesitation that time, no rational explanation, no maybe. I said, get in my truck right now. She didn't argue, which probably saved us both time we didn't have. I left her car where it was, jack untouched, tools on the ground. We got into my truck, doors slammed, and I was already throwing it into drive before her seatbelt clicked. Gravel sprayed. The SUV hit the shoulder behind us just as I pulled back toward the interstate access. I didn't look long. One glance in the mirror, enough to see it commit to the turn. Then I drove, not heroically, messily. Too fast in places, not fast enough in others, checking mirrors so often it made the lanes feel unreal. The woman kept asking if they were following us, and I kept saying I don't know, which was true and not helpful. We took the next lit exit with an open station, pulled in among two semis in a family van, and I called state police from my personal phone, not company channels. By the time anybody official took my statement, the SUV was gone. Of course it was. The stranded woman's vehicle was later recovered. Mine had roadside tools missing from where I dropped them, which means someone either passed by and helped themselves or came looking after we left. I know which version I believe. Dispatch said there had been some radio bleed issue, then a routing glitch, then a vendor systems overlap. The explanations changed just enough each time to keep my trust from ever landing on one. I reported everything. Logs, plate, repeated phrase, secondary number, the open transmission with my location. I did it formally. If I was wrong, I wanted to be wrong on paper. If I was right, I wanted there to be at least one place where the shape of it existed outside my own head. I quit roadside assistance not long after. Maybe I should say I chose to leave, but that's too polished. I quit because I couldn't pull onto a shoulder after dark without feeling watched from 3 directions at once. I quit because every unfamiliar vehicle that held behind me for more than 2 exits made my chest go tight. I quit because once you hear your own dispatcher feed your location into a line you were never supposed to be listening to, the job is over whether you hand in the uniform or not. I still check mirrors compulsively during nighttime drives. I still memorize plates without meaning to. My husband jokes that I could identify half the county from the grocery store parking lot if he spun me around fast enough. And I laugh because the alternative is explaining why I track tail lights the way some people track weather. The worst part is that nothing I found proved the whole size of it. There were logs. There were odd reroutes. There was a dead owner's SUV that should not have existed on the road. There were drivers who got approached by polite strangers who knew too much. There were abandoned vehicles that sat too long without tags. Enough for alarm, not enough for closure. And what I never learned, what still doesn't let me fully relax when somebody unfamiliar sits on my bumper through the dark stretches, is whether that unauthorized dispatch system actually ended after I reported it, or if it just shifted names, changed companies, and kept using different frequencies.